Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you all for being here this morning, especially those of you who were here last week and intentionally returned. That's a real confidence boost for me, so I appreciate it. Today we're going to be launching into part 2 of our series on the I Am. The I Am, of course, being that name that God gave to himself when asked by Moses in Exodus. Briefly, some of the terms we talked about last week, we went over that initial term, Ege, Asher, Ege, that God gives out of the burning bush that means I am, that I am. As we went over last time, it gets a lot more complicated than that. We also talked about Yahweh also delivers to Moses out of the burning bush. It's that phrase that is the proper personal I am name of God. That can also be said to mean I am, but only with the understanding that it is always a name and never a word in Hebrew like Ege is. We then also briefly touched on Adonai, on Elohim, on Jehovah. So if you're interested in that, weren't able to be with us last week, that's all available on YouTube and Twitter. So today we're going to move on to this next phrase, Anywho. So Anywho, typically rendered in English phonetically.
We're going to change the battery.
Yeah, certainly. So anywho is this Hebrew phrase. It's typically rendered into the English phonetically as A-N-I-H-U, as you can see in my subtitle, anywho. And it's this Hebrew phrase that it occurs in Ezekiel, it occurs in Deuteronomy, but mostly it occurs in Isaiah. And it's a sort of euphemism for the very name of God. It's a way of saying I am without saying Yahweh. And it gets translated into the English. Is that better? There we go. It gets translated into the English as I am he. Now, those of you who were with us last week will stop me there and say, wait a minute. We said last week that there was no way to say I am in Hebrew. We said last week that, in fact, the verb to be can't be rendered in anything like the present tense in Hebrew. And this is so. This phrase, anywho, if it were directly translated, would just be I, he. So this is where we need to talk about another Bible convention, much like the two different spellings of Lord that we talked about last time. There are occasions where a word is not present in the original language, but the translators feel either that the word is implied, and that implication is much stronger in the original language and thus needs to be there for English understanding, or when a word is not present, but the translators feel that it's required for proper English syntax, right, for the English sentence to sound right. Whenever these are the case, whenever the word is implied or it's necessary for syntax, the translators will add that word, but the word will appear in italics. And those italics are to let you, the reader, know that that's not there in the original language, that the translators added that. So this phrase, it'll appear as I am he, but it'll be I am in parentheses, it'll be I am in italics, and then he, to let you know that that am wasn't there originally. But in this case, the translators are really doing us a favor, because I am is the way to understand this phrase, both in its use and in its meaning in the Bible. So this phrase, anywho, is going to be our link between several verses in the Old Testament and several verses in the New Testament. It's basically going to serve as our link from the Old Testament into the New. And it's going to be so foundational in that regard that I'm not just going to ask you to take my word for it that this phrase means I am, but we're going to spend the rest of today really rooting and grounding ourselves in the knowledge that that is so. And we're going to do that two ways. First, we're going to look at these Isaiah passages, and we're going to read this phrase, anywho, in context. So we kind of see how it stands within the Bible, how the Bible uses it, what it means. I know we all come to Sunday school to get something we can't get reading on our own at home, but I do love just reading the Bible and letting it speak for itself. So we're going to do some of that. And then secondly, we're going to take advantage of some ancient scholarship. We're going to see how this phrase was translated in the oldest major translation of the Bible out of its original Hebrew Aramaic. And that's a translation that was done about 200 years before the birth of Christ, called the Septuagint. And by way of talking about how it translated it, we'll take a look at about what that is and kind of set it in its historical context so we know why that should matter to us. But first off, we're going to read some of these passages in Isaiah, and as I read them, I'm going to be doing two things. One, anytime we encounter that Lord in all caps, I'm going to render it as Yahweh, as I say it out loud. I think in the context of this study, that helps us keep grounded and focused on what it is we're talking about, the I am name of God. And then also, when we encounter the phrase Anywho, I'm going to leave it as Anywho. That way we can isolate it in context and you can see how it's being used in the context of the verse. That's kind of the point of the exercise. So these two things I'm just not going to translate. I'm going to leave them in Hebrew, or the closest I can come to actually speaking Hebrew. And we're going to start in Isaiah 41, and just to give you some context on these passages, this whole portion of Scripture, Isaiah chapters 40 through 45, is a portion of Scripture we call the trial of the false gods. And what it is, it takes on the language of a legal proceeding where God is rhetorically challenging these false gods that the Israelites have been worshiping to prove that they're gods like him. I say rhetorically because, of course, his real audience is the Israelites themselves. But what it takes the form of is this round after round of God saying, I am this, and I am that, and what are you? I have this quality and this characteristic, and what do you have? And because of that, this passage is really important to us theologically because it's just so dense with information about God that a lot of what we know about the character and the quality of God is actually derived from these 5 chapters. So the first 3 verses we look at will all be drawn from this portion, this trial of the false gods, and we'll start with Isaiah 41 and 4. Who hath wrought and done it, calling the generations from the beginning? I, Yahweh, the first and with the last, Anywho. So this expression I love, calling the generations from the beginning, what he's essentially saying there is calling time itself into existence. So we start out the verse knowing we're talking about time. And we spoke some last week about Hebrew language, how it doesn't have time-rooted verb tenses like we do, past, present, and future. And I'm going to extend that a little further and tell you that it's almost as if the Hebrew language itself is designed to reserve the present tense of being, to reserve I am, to God and God alone. And that's why we end up with these sort of linguistic gymnastics of Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh, and Anywho to try to say something that actually isn't very easy at all to say in Hebrew. Now that being said, the Israelites had their concept of time just like we do in past, present, and future. So in this verse, we indicate sort of God's eternity by rooting it in those 3 time periods with one of those I am expressions anchoring the present tense, right? I, Yahweh, the first, all the way to the past, with the last, all the way to the future, and Anywho, right now. So indicating that eternal existence. And that's a triplicate we're going to find repeated in several of these verses, including the next one, Isaiah 43 and 10. Ye are my witnesses, saith Yahweh, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand Anywho. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. So, again, taking the language of a legal proceeding, he's calling witnesses, in this case calling the entire people of Israel who can witness what he has done, and then ending with, again, this triplicate. Before me was no God in the past, neither after me, and then that Anywho, that I am phrase anchoring the present time period. One thing we should also note as we go through these verses, all of them are going to be in the context of God speaking, right? This phrase, Anywho, never appears in the mouth of a man. It's always in an address by God that it's going to appear. We're going to go on to 43:13, where it says, Yea, before the day was, Anywho, there is none that can deliver out of my hand. I will work, and who shall let it? So this is a phrase where the evolution of the English language has served to make this less clear than it could be, namely because we don't use the word let this way anymore, except perhaps in sewing when you talk about letting out a pair of pants. But to the modern ear, probably a better way to explain this would be, I will work and who will roll it back, or I will work and who will reverse it. Right? And note here the conflict of tenses at the beginning where it says, before the day was, Anywho, right? So before the day was, I am. It's conflict of tenses we'll see repeated in the New Testament, so just tuck that away, and we'll come back to it next week. These next 3 verses we'll look at are also in Isaiah, but drawn from passages other than this section, the trial of the false gods. We'll go next to 46 and 4, where it says, And even to your old age, Anywho, Even to your hoar hairs will I carry you. I have made and I will bear. Even I will carry and will deliver you. And I thought this one was great because he again uses this triplicate of time periods, but this time not in eternity to represent his eternal existence, but by telling you that from, I bear you, right, from the beginning, and to hoar hairs. That's a phrase you don't hear a lot. Read that as gray hairs, right, where gray hairs is indicating old age, right? So from your birth to as old as you will get, anywho, I am in the present with you. We'll move on now to Isaiah 48 and 12, where it says, Hearken unto me, O Jacob, and Israel, my called, anywho, I am the first, I also am the last. Now this is just great. I mean, the whole Bible is great, but this is an excellent turn of phrase, right? Because Jacob and Israel are the same person, right? Israel's name change wasn't like Abraham's, where it was permanent. After Israel's name change, the Bible continues to refer to him as both Jacob and Israel. But the context is important, because he tends to get called Jacob when he's acting according to his old nature, when he's acting in the flesh. And he tends to get called Israel when he's acting according to his new nature, answering the call of God. Israel's 12 sons become the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. So Israel then becomes an idiom for all the people generally. So in this verse, we're using Israel as an idiom for all the people generally, but we're also using Jacob as an idiom for those people so that we can reprise this dichotomy and say, Hearken to me, O Jacob, you Israelites who are living wickedly, living according to the flesh, and Israel my called, those Israelites who despite your captivity are still living righteously, embracing the call of God. Both of you need to hear this thing that's coming up next, which is, Anywho, I am. I am the first, I also am the last. So again, this eternal, self-existent nature being referenced in the three time periods. And then lastly, we'll look at my favorite of the Isaiah verses, which is Isaiah 52 and 6. Therefore my people shall know my name. Therefore they shall know in that day, Anywho doth speak. Behold, it is I. So I'm just going to let that one stand on its own. That gives you a flavor of the usage in the Old Testament. There are more that I cut for time. If you're interested in an exhaustive list, you just type in Anywho uses in the Old Testament in any search engine. I know you can run it down at Blue Letter Bible. I'm sure there are other places. But we're going to move on and look at some of the ancient scholarship. And we're going to look at this version they call the Septuagint version. And before we look at how they translate it, we're going to look at why that's important to us and what it is. So firstly, why the Septuagint is going to be important. It's going to be important for three reasons. Firstly, it's a translation into Greek. And as I may have mentioned last time, Greek is an extremely precise and exacting language. It doesn't have the contextual dependence. It doesn't have the ambiguity that Hebrew does, not even that English does. So it really nails things down exactly. Secondly, it's going to be important, maybe not necessarily in the context of this study, but to us as Christians generally, because it was translated about 200 years before the birth of Christ, which means that it rendered all these prophecies of Messiah into Greek precision before anything was known about the actual life of Christ, meaning it is necessarily devoid of any bias from translators wanting to show that Jesus was or was not the Messiah, just because of the timing in which it occurred. And the third reason, closely related to the second of its timing, is that this Septuagint version is going to be the Bible in hand for the first century believer. And that's important because it means that if this is the Bible that the people whom Jesus was speaking to during his ministry had, then if Jesus says something that appears to be a reference to, a quote from, or an allusion to the text of that version, we should see that as a deliberate attempt at communication with people who would have been familiar with that text. So I want to set the Septuagint sort of in its correct time frame in the course of history so that you kind of know what it is we're talking about here. And for ease of understanding, I want to use this image that the Bible itself provides in the book of Daniel. And when this dream was given to Nebuchadnezzar and interpreted by Daniel, it was a prophecy of the future. But that was 2,800 years ago. So we're going to use it as a summary of the past. because this very neatly outlines the empires that held sway in Israel. And it's this image of a statue that had a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, a stomach of brass, legs of iron, and feet of iron mixed with clay. And it very neatly outlines these empires, starting with the head of gold, which was the Babylonian Empire. This would have been contemporary with Daniel. The Babylonians came in, they conquered Israel, they destroyed Solomon's temple, and they took the upper class of the Israelites away into the captivity. And they did this because, like most ancient empires, to maintain legitimacy, they had to be constantly conquering, which means they needed the army out conquering and not putting down rebellions. When they conquered a new territory, what they would do, they would take the upper class, the leaders, the administrators, the princes, they would mix them around in the empire, the idea being that we didn't want to waste that talent, right? They were still functioning as leaders, as administrators, but if they were over a people that were not their own, they'd be less likely to work together against the empire. That was the idea. So this is how Daniel found himself in Nebuchadnezzar's court in the first place. But the Babylonians are eventually conquered by the Persians. And this is an event that's chronicled in the Bible. This is the event with Belteshazzar, where Belteshazzar and his friends are sitting around getting drunk out of vessels that were looted from Solomon's temple. And he sees the handwriting on the wall, literally, where we get that expression from. It's Medi, Medi, Tekel, Upharsin, you're weighed in the balance and found wanting. And then the Persians divert the Euphrates River and come in under the waterway and conquer the city and thus the empire. And the Persians have a much more light touch approach to empire building. So under them, the Israelites are allowed to return home in an event known as the Return. This is the time period where the events of Ezra and Nehemiah take place. This is where Nehemiah rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem, and Zerubbabel builds the second temple, an event so significant that historians call this, in the incredibly creative way in which historians name everything, the Second Temple period. The Persians eventually, though, give way to the Grecian Empire, and this is not chronicled in the Bible because it takes place in those so-called silent years between the Old and New Testament. And if the phrase Grecian Empire doesn't ring familiar to you, most of you are probably more familiar with the emperor than the empire itself, because this was the conquest of Alexander the Great that spread the Grecian Empire. Now, it falls to the Roman Empire, which is represented by the legs of iron. You'll all note in the New Testament, it's the Romans who are in charge in Jerusalem and Judea, and fittingly, it's represented by the legs, because remember, the Roman Empire had two legs, the Western Roman Empire centered in Rome, and the Eastern centered in Constantinople. And then the feet mixed with clay represents the eventual dissolution of the Roman Empire into the modern nation states that you'll know and love from your globes and maps today. So in this overall course of history, the Septuagint occurs in that brass area, in the Grecian Empire. And this is because the transition between the Greece and Rome didn't happen like the others, right? The Persians conquered the Babylonians. The Grecians conquered the Persians. But Rome never faced a united Greek empire. What happened? When Alexander the Great died, he left no clear successor. And so his empire sort of fell apart into kingdoms where all of his generals just ruled directly over those areas for which they were military governors already, and became separate kingdoms. If we get that map, please. So this whole shaded area is what was originally Alexander the Great's empire. It was the largest empire the world had known at that time. And when it fell apart, it went to his generals. But the point I want to make is they were all Greek-speaking. So even though these are separate kingdoms, Greek is the lingua franca throughout this entire area. Okay? It was the language of government. It was the language of scholarship. It was the language of trade. This conversion to everyone speaking Greek is actually so important historically that this kicks off an era that historians call the Hellenistic era, right? Helena being the Greek word for a Greek-speaking person. And it's during this time that the Septuagint gets translated, again, from the original Hebrew/Aramaic into Greek. So this map is just a snapshot in time, right? These people were always at war with each other, and the borders change, and some of them go away, and others come. But the two that are relatively long-lived and stable are the Seleucids in the east and the Ptolemies in Egypt. And it's the Ptolemies we want to look at because it's in Alexandria, Egypt, that this translation takes place. And it takes place under Ptolemy II, and there's a story about how it came to be that explains its name, because Septuagint means 70, right? It's a shortening of translation of the 70, which is how it was known. And it comes from this story of its creation from the letter of Aristeas, and it's a primary source, but it has some problems, so I'll give you the story as he gives it, and then we'll talk about what we can validate and what we can't. But according to Aristeas, Ptolemy II, so first off, the thing you understand, the Ptolemies, the Egyptians took to the Ptolemies as basically successors to the pharaohs of old. And just like for the pharaohs, they engaged in these massive building projects, right? They built the lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They also built the library of Alexandria. And this library is why Alexandria, for this entire Greek-speaking world, was a center of learning and scholarship and education. And according to Aristeas, Ptolemy II decided he needed a copy of the Hebrew scriptures for his library, and of course it needed to be in Greek, because everything was in Greek, right? They all spoke Greek. So he has the head of the library send to the high priest in Jerusalem and ask for 6 scholars, right, who are upstanding and righteous before the Lord, excellent in their knowledge of the scripture. He wants 6 such men from each tribe of Israel, right? So 6 times 12, 72 scholars who all get sent to Alexandria. They work together to translate all these scriptures into Greek. And they first do the Torah, right, the 5 books of Moses, sometimes called the Pentateuch. And after that, some of these scholars go back home, some remain, other scholars come. There's a permanent center of Hebrew scholarship established at Alexandria, and over the next 100 years, all the books of the Old Testament get translated. And then this translation collectively gets called the Septuagint. There's some suspicion that he emphasized that it was done at the behest of the king to sort of improve relations between the pagans and the Jews at the time. So we're not really confident whether Ptolemy asked for the copy to be made or if he just took one after it was made. But the parts we can verify is that the timing is right. It was done under the reign of Ptolemy II, and that the sequence is right. The first 5 books of Moses were done first, and the rest came later. And the other part we can verify is, it's hard to believe, but in this Hellenistic world, there were more Jews living in Alexandria, Egypt, than there were living in Jerusalem, right? So a Greek Bible was desperately needed, and this Septuagint version, as soon as it was presented to the Jews at Alexandria, they immediately wanted copies. They made copies of those copies, and it very quickly spread throughout this Hellenistic world. It was held in very high regard. So to emphasize, these are some of the best scholars of the 2nd century BC, and we want to look at how did they render this phrase, anihu, into Greek. And the answer is ego imi, right? And ego imi means I am, okay? Greek has a present tense of everything. They have a first person of everything. This is exactly, precisely I am, exactly like you or I would use I am in English. So this is important because it not only shows us that, because think about this, Hebrew is a language that doesn't have a way to say I am. And yet, some of the best scholars of this age said the most appropriate way to translate this phrase into Greek is I am. So we should really take note of that a language that can't say this is how they thought was the best rendering of this phrase. And so that's important because it not only shows us that that's how the scholars of this era understood it, but because it's the Bible in hand for the 1st century believer, this is the understanding that all those people who heard Jesus and the apostles' ministries would have had also. Now you may ask, how can I know that? Right? I mean, obviously this translation was made from Hebrew scriptures that were around at the time. How do I know these 1st century believers were reading the Greek Septuagint Bible and not copies of these Hebrew texts they were translated from? Well, with so much of history this far back, I can't know. But we can make a pretty good guess based on the evidence. And the evidence in this case is the New Testament. You may note as you read your New Testament that the Old Testament gets quoted quite a lot. In fact, there are over 300 quotes of the Old Testament in the New Testament. And so if we look at the Septuagint versus the oldest Hebrew text we had, which is the Masoretic, which unfortunately is not as old as the Septuagint, none of those texts survive, but it's the closest approximation we have. And if we compare them, we can say, okay, out of these New Testament quotes, how often are they so close together that we couldn't tell what was being quoted, and how often are they different? The answer is 20% of the time they're exactly the same, and 80% of the time they're different enough that we could tell what version it's being quoted from. So of those that are different, how many seem to be quoting the Septuagint? And the answer is 90%. So 90% of the quotes that are different are referencing this Septuagint version of the Bible. So we can at least say that for the writers of the New Testament, the Septuagint seemed to be the Bible that they were reading and that they were quoting from. So for completeness sake then, we could go back to the beginning and we say, okay, they took this Anywho phrase and they translated it as ego imi. If we go all the way back to Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am that I am, spoken by God out of the burning bush, how did they translate this? And the answer is ego imi huon. Now, this is the exact same ego imi, I am, and huon would be who is. So I am who is how they handled this phrase. Now, if you go to double check me, which I always suggest you run things down for yourself, when you go to double check me on this, if you were to search how is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh translated in the Septuagint, the first result, a cursory search, is probably going to return something like I am the being. And this is not wrong. It's just a somewhat looser translation, right? I am who is a direct translation. And you can see why. I am the being sounds right in English. I am who is sounds awkward. It's not proper syntax. The reason I like to keep it as I am who is to note another connection with this phrase, which is, you may remember last Sunday during song service, Sister Jaco quoted a verse from Revelation about the four beasts around the throne who are constantly saying, holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. So that phrase, who was and is to come, in Greek is ho in, kai ho on, kai ho erhleme. So that ho on for who is this same ho on from I am who is. So I like to keep it this way just to keep center of mind this connection between those passages in Revelation and this passage from the Septuagint. So that's where we'll leave it for today. This phrase ego imi, next time we're going to pick up this phrase ego imi and we're going to run with it all the way into the New Testament and look at some of the sayings of Jesus, and we'll connect back to this. And I've left about 3 minutes before the break if there were any questions.
Do we have any questions? No. Probably everybody's trying to process what he just said, right? There's a lot in what he's just said. It's incredible. It's really incredible to take. And I don't know how to speak Hebrew, so my goodness, I can't even imagine, or Greek, either one, or any other language, matter of fact. So the time that he's invested into bringing this to us, and it's so amazing that it's almost speechless at times, you know what I mean? To see here what he's teaching from the old to the new, and then he correlates them all together, and then we say the stuff all the time without really knowing what we're saying. So I appreciate his research and all the time and effort that he's put into it. I think we could probably do this all year long and never end it. I mean, there's just so much. You can't exhaust God's Word because of the translations and how it went from Hebrew to Greek to all these other. Thank you, Brother Brandon.
I should have added a preface to just apologize to anyone who actually speaks Greek or Hebrew. I was one of those persons who was blessed with the love of history, but cursed with actually no talent at all for languages. So, if you actually speak Greek or Hebrew, I'm sorry.
No apology needed, because I don't know anybody in here that can speak either one of them, so you're good. Except for those that might be watching live stream. There might be a few out there. So thank you, Brother Brandon, again. Incredible to bring the history into it. I know that there are people loving this. I think we got a few more weeks. And like I was telling him earlier today, there is just in no possible way you could exhaust what he's teaching. There's just so much depth to it that we won't even be able to touch the surface of it right now. So we're just getting really a scratch of it, really, of anything. So again, thank you, Brother Brandon, for your investigation and everything that you're doing, man. I appreciate it. So next week, come back. We're going to do more of this. Hopefully you're getting a pen or paper, or you're going back and watching this. Post it, share it, whatever you can do, because Brandon is doing an incredible job with this. All right, so let's get ready for church. Or the main service. We're already in church. Just the main service.